My name is Lanre Akinola. I'm currently the head of content at the Norwegian African Business Association, which promotes investment from Norway into Africa. My area of expertise, in a way, is quite broad, but I've spent most of my career working in news media, exclusively focused on Africa. I've been doing that for coming up to a decade and a half now, and I would say, in general, it's content. It's networks, it's event, it's bringing people together and hopefully making things happen that contributes to the progress of Africa. How does my work relate to climate change? Well, at the moment, as I said, the overriding mission of what we do at the Norwegian African Business Association, NABA for short, is to promote investment from Norway into Africa, to build partnerships between Norway and the wider Nordic region in Africa. And that goes, it kind of goes hand in hand with the issue of climate change. This is a region that is very heavily focused on sustainability, very heavily focused on climate action, on climate smart investing. And as we all know, I'm really stating the obvious here, there is arguably no more pressing challenge across Africa than the issue of tackling the impact of climate change. Yeah, we know the story. Africa has contributed the least historically to emissions, but it is in many ways the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So doing something about that is absolutely imperative for the prosperity and development of the continent. And given the fundamental importance of investment, financing, in critical sectors like energy, like agriculture, things that we will get into in the course of this discussion, it just goes hand in hand with what we do. And let me give you one example. Our main focus area at the moment is on the so-called critical minerals. That is, all of those minerals that Africa is so rich in, that are essential to the green transition, which the whole world is now scrambling to get its hands on. And for us, the mission is to bring together people who are not only going to invest in this important space, but are going to do so on the basis of sustainability, on the basis that it also contributes to sustainable and green growth. So that's how I would summarize it. The issue of investment is central to this debate on climate change. And let's maybe just kind of set the scene a little bit here. Money is not the be-all and end-all of climate action. That's something that's really important to say at the outset. However, it is also self-evident that without a massive ramping up of financing, be that public or principally private, investment into climate-geared investments, so climate smart investing, if you want to call it that, African economies are not going to be able to meaningfully tackle the issue of climate change. It's just not going to happen. And there's a kind of paradox that we're looking at the moment, which is that we know, and anyone who even has a cursory familiarity with Africa will understand that the continent has massive potential when it comes to things like renewable energy. And we know how critical and how core that is to the global debate on climate change and climate action at the moment. At the same time, however, the continent consistently struggles to attract large-scale investment. So one statistic is that I think over the last 2 decades, this is according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, Africa has accounted for something like 2% of all financing and all investment that has gone into renewable energy, right? Which is kind of, in a way, kind of dumbfounding, given just how much renewable energy potential there is on the continent. We all know about solar, we know about hydro, we know about wind, and now we are starting to also get a better understanding of the continent's potential for things like green ammonia or so-called green hydrogen, right? So there's this paradox where it's like, okay, we're having this debate globally about we must transition out of fossil fuels. We must transition to renewables. You look at Africa and you're like, okay, this is a part of the world that could provide a huge chunk of the energy that you're talking about and that you're looking for. Yet, for some reason, the world is very hesitant when it comes to investing. Now, what's going on here is the question. I think there's a number of factors. Let's start with the issue of perception. That's key. People, anyone who's familiar with Africa will understand that the continent has a very persistent perception problem, in that the perception of risk, the perception of problems, the perception of difficulties of doing business on the continent, they are consistently exaggerated. And that has, for a long time, this is, whether you're talking climate change, whether you're talking any type of investment, has been a problem. A lot of people, once you say Africa, if you're traveling off the continent and you're talking to people and you're making a case, even if it's a great case, you mention Africa, suddenly, that, people sort of, retreat, and they're like, oh, Africa, that's too scary, it's too risky. Now, that's one of the issues. And changing that perception and tackling the narrative that kind of comes with that when it comes to climate change. And that narrative tends to be one of a continent that is kind of, helpless. It's a victim, principally a victim of climate change. It's not an agent in terms of driving climate action. That's one thing that has to be addressed. And we can talk more about that, because there's important things to be kind of understood there. However, what I would also say is that, capital isn't necessarily particularly biased when it comes to where it goes. In fact, there's a fairly strong correlation between having the right conditions and the ability to attract large amounts of capital. So while the perception issue is definitely a real one, we also have to be very honest when we talk about the need for more investment into the continent, about the real barriers that do exist. So they're just kind of basics that you need, regardless of what part of the world you're looking at, in order to get international capital in particular to buy into what you're selling. Things like basic infrastructure, power, transportation, those sorts of things. We obviously, things like the right policy and regulatory framework, political stability, scalable markets, and these kinds of things, right? And the honest assessment is that Africa, in many cases, has a lot of work to do. Many African economies have a lot of work to do. Whether we're talking about the need to drive integration, whether we're talking about the need to improve and put in place the kind of just basic core infrastructure that you need that enables, the deployment of large amounts of capital, the development of large scale renewable energy projects, for example, which is, of course, what we really want to see happen more and more. I'm not saying it isn't happening. Right? There are examples of that, and there is money flowing into the sector, and it has been increasing, but it's simply nowhere near what's needed, one, which is important, but two, what is possible. Yeah. So I think there's those two dynamics are two of the important factors to understand. One, there is a general misconception about the difficulty and risk that comes with doing business in Africa. But two, there are also real issues that have to be tackled in order to if you want to simplify, tick the boxes, so to speak, to attract the kind of money that will really ramp up renewable energy investment on the continent. There's a lot more to be said about that, but I think that for me, those two dynamics are kind of important to understanding what's holding back large scale investment. It's a tricky question, because in a way it's it's easy one to answer, and at the same time a nearly impossible one to answer. The simple answer is what can be done and what is being done. Well, first of all, a lot is the answer to what can be done, and the answer to what is being done, not enough. That's the short answer. Yeah. Now we have to break. We read this is a question that you really have to break down, and you could spend a huge amount of time trying to really kind of going into details on this. Let me say a few things about what can and is being done, and perhaps what should happen. I spoke earlier about the need to be honest about real barriers to doing business on the continent, real barriers to deploying capital, especially at scale on the continent. Yeah, it is there are just realities that have to be addressed, and whenever we have this conversation, we're looking at climate change and climate action here today, but it doesn't matter what aspect of economic development, what aspect of investment you're talking about when it comes to the African context. There is just a basic need to improve the levels of governance, and much more importantly, and I don't want to sound like I'm reciting some Western playbook here talking about governance. That's not my point. The point is about the implementation of proper policies, the formulation and implementation of effective policies, effective reforms. It's, there's really no secret here. This is something that we are eternally debating, and anybody who's honest with themselves kind of understands it, that we have a bit of a deficit when it comes to, walking the walk on the policy side in Africa. There are lots of good ideas, great initiatives, very, very well thought out, meticulous plans, which all too often, unfortunately, kind of stumble when it comes to the implementation phase. Regional integration, I think, is an example of that. So, at a very basic level, what can be done, what must be done, is you just have to, stop the talking, start the walking in terms of policies and implementation of those policies. Another thing that can be done, and actually before I move on, and look, there are obviously things that are being done, steps that are being taken to move the needle, and specifically on climate action. In September, we had the first ever Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi. And that for me, in many ways, was a kind of quite a landmark moment, in that it for the first time demonstrated a sort of coherence and unity of purpose amongst African leaders, amongst the public and private sector, when it comes to getting serious about the need to meaningfully drive climate action. That is a really positive sign, I think. It's never happened before, and it speaks to a tremendous amount of work that has been done, in recent years, is underway now, and the growing realization and acceptance and seriousness amongst policymakers, amongst people in business, about the need to really make things happen. So, there are things. Things are definitely happening now. The test, of course, is what's going to happen after the summit. What happens when everyone goes back home? Who is going to follow through? What is actually going to be delivered? And there, we should definitely not be cynical or pessimistic about the outlook. But I think we have to be very vigilant, and we have to make sure that the words that come out of things like the Africa Climate Summit, the pledges that come out of that they don't remain in the realm of words and pledges, that they actually turn into tangible action. And if you, depending on what part of the continent you're looking at, there are also countries doing really interesting things in terms of driving renewable energy. Kenya being a case in point. Kenya, I think, now generates over 90% of its energy from renewables, and there's a target to hit 100% by the end of the decade, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong on that one. Countries like Morocco are investing heavily in renewable energy. Egypt is investing massively in developing renewable energy, and not just your sort of familiar types of renewables like solar and hydro, but they're pumping a lot of money into things like green hydrogen and green ammonia. Places like Namibia are kind of below radar, but very interesting things going on there. And you could go on. I think the point here is that things are happening. We need a lot more, and we need to move a lot faster. That's the kind of the long and short of it. And then one more thing I to say, and it's a little bit related to the first point, is this issue of the narrative. And I think this is where occasions like the Africa Climate Summit are important. Because in the imagination of too many people globally, not everyone, mind you, this is also important. It's not as though the world has some homogenous view of Africa. There are parts of the world that have a much more nuanced understanding of the continent, and don't come with a lot of the conventional and received wisdom. However, there are still a lot of people in important places, important parts of the world that have an antiquated perspective about Africa as a place that is, yeah, as I alluded to earlier, is kind of helpless. It's just kind of this helpless victim in the face of climate change. Oh, all we can do is wait for the world to help us, and that's simply not the case. And all you have to do, I'll say it again, is look at what happened in Nairobi in September, the summit there, the momentum from COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt last year, the momentum that's not going to go into COP28. What you're looking at is a continent that is getting serious and getting its act together. Very important. Long story short, we need to see a lot more of this. And if we can, keep up the pace and build momentum, good things will happen. There's a lot to be said about this. I mean, in many ways, you could argue that it's kind of across the board, but allow me to focus on maybe a couple of areas, maybe a few areas that really stand out. The obvious one is renewable energy. I've already addressed this and discussed this, but the potential for renewable energy production in Africa, not just for domestic needs, but also for export, is just immense. Absolutely immense. Nobody has doubts about that. So anybody who is thinking about, renewable energy, where in the world should we be looking at? Africa ought to be very high on your list of places to look at. That is not to say it is easy. That is not to say you can just go there and make things magically happen, but energy right up there. Another one that is very quickly coming through now, especially over the last sort of 12, 18 months, is this issue of critical minerals. So critical minerals are things like lithium, manganese, copper, cobalt, and other mineral resources that go into the production of batteries, EV batteries, and are in general, and pardon the pun, they are critical to the whole green transition. This whole global green transition doesn't happen without these critical minerals. Now, it's hard to get a concrete figure on this, but the statistic that's kind of generally accepted is that Africa is home to around a third of global mineral reserves. So that's critical and non-critical minerals, and a huge chunk of those are so-called critical minerals. The continent is also actually quite heavily underexplored. So it is very likely that what we currently know about the deposits and reserves that the continent has is actually a massive underestimation of what's really there. And what you're seeing is that much of the world is actually, I was going to say scramble, but that's not the right word. Much of the world is rushing now to get their hands on this. And we're seeing huge amounts of investment from every part of the world, including, the big powers, the US's, the Chinas of this world, the Europeans, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of African countries are very quickly wising up to this and understanding that, this critical minerals issue is not only a massive investment opportunity, but because of its centrality to the green transition, also a huge opportunity to drive economic development. By that, I'm particularly talking about the value chain, because we all know that that mining does not exactly have a particularly distinguished history in Africa in terms of its contribution to the continent's well-being, to put it mildly. And a really important debate is currently underway about how African producers of these minerals do not get stuck at the bottom of the value chain this time around. and actually move up that value chain, from processing to manufacturing to production to ultimately becoming manufacturing centers for things like EV batteries and even electric vehicles, which to the skeptic might sound like an unrealistic ambition, to which my response would be, take a close look at a country like Morocco, a place in where, I think just in the last few months, um, at least three multi-billion-dollar investments have been announced into building manufacturing plants for either EV batteries or EV components, EV materials, massive investment coming out of Asia into that. And that is an illustration of how Africa can actually become quite an important player in this, and how the potential for this to really drive investment, economic development, I think is huge, and it is going to seriously scale up in the next few years. For me, I think that is one of the most important areas to be looking at. Agriculture is another, but I think agriculture is a little bit more difficult, because the case is not as clear cut as something like minerals. The world needs those minerals, needs them now. We all know that Africa, in principle, has the potential to obviously not just feed itself, but feed much of the world. But the agriculture sector, it's one of those really tough nuts to crack. I'm not an expert in it, but my what I do know about it is that there's still a lot of work to be done to really get investment going. But that is obviously, right, an area that ought to be a focus. And and more broadly, and food production, food systems are certainly a part of this. You have this idea of the circular economy, right? That instead of just produce and waste, what you do is you bring it back together and you reuse as much as possible in the production of goods, the production of crops and foods, or whatever it might be. At early days in Africa, early days globally, to be honest, in that respect. But those are also areas in which we're definitely going to see some movement in the coming years. I'm not going to be too bullish about it. It's a difficult one. It's difficult to predict how it's going to go. But things will certainly happen to a lesser or greater degree. And for me, I would say those are some of the most important opportunities to be cognizant of at this point. So the question for me about who's investing or who will do the investing, that kind of there are multiple dimensions to that question. One is just a purely practical dimension, right? Which is, where's the money coming from? Pure and simple. And I would say that increasingly, I don't have the figures to hand. First thing to say is it's not enough. Okay, like that's always it's always a good place to start. It's not enough, but it's growing, and there are more and more parts of the world that are taking an interest in the continent. So for me, one of the important trends, and this was kind of kicked off around the turn of the century, and it has been consistent ever since, and is really accelerated, is that we've gone from a situation in which 20, 30 years ago, much of the world wasn't particularly interested in Africa, to a situation today where there really isn't a part of the world that isn't keen to build economic or commercial ties with the continent, whether that is your quote unquote traditional partners in the West, or the so-called new partners in places like the Middle East and Asia. China obviously is investing heavily, and China is actually increasingly now looking at investing in renewable energy, ramping that up, and I think you're going to see a significant ramping up of that in the coming years. They're behind some of those major investments into Morocco that I mentioned earlier. The Gulf states, I think, they're stepping up quite significantly. They have done in recent years. Places like Turkey, and there's here I'm going to be a little bit critical, maybe even a bit controversial. There's lots of rhetoric coming out of places like the EU, A lot of rhetoric coming out of places like the US, but there's not that much of putting your money where your mouth is from those regions, I would say, at this point, which has a lot to do with how they perceive the continent. But long story short, there is that you're seeing an increasing diversification in sort of international capital that is heading to Africa. And that can only be a good thing. It fosters competition. It provides the ability to build partnerships with different actors that have different strengths, and all of that is good news. Now, another dimension to this for me is, and in a way I kind of touched on this, is that we cannot ignore that we are currently living through a time of rather consequential change in terms of the global economic, political, and geopolitical order. I'm not going to, touch on anything too controversial, but all I would say is, in terms of, the future of climate action, future of investing in climate smart investing, and investing to support climate action in a meaningful way on the continent. A lot of African governments right now, I would say, need to ask themselves an important question, which is, which way is the wind blowing? What does the future of the global economy look like? What is our position within that? And what does that mean for our external partnerships? I don't want to go too far into this because it gets very contentious very quickly. But the way I would put it quite simply is that you have old partners and then you have new partners. And it's not necessarily the old partners that are going to change the game. Tough one. This is a very tough one. Not conducive enough is the simple answer. For reasons that are not new or unique or specific to the issue of climate change and climate action. But rather, it's the kind of familiar checklist of things that need to be done. We discussed this a little bit earlier, where I made the point that the difficulty or the issue that we have across Africa all too often isn't necessarily that we don't know what needs to be done, that we don't have the plans, we don't have the ideas and the vision of what needs to be done, is that the implementation isn't there, the follow-through isn't there. We don't have to reinvent anything in terms of creating an environment in which it makes sense, it is commercially viable and sustainable to invest in, with the view to supporting climate action on the continent, right? It's having the right policies, it's instituting the right kinds of reforms, it's making sure that you develop human capital, it's making sure that you drive regional integration, it's making sure you have infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So, in a way, it's kind of like, well, it's a familiar answer, because this, the same, like, the problems that apply to other spheres of economic development across the continent are almost invariably going to translate over into the sphere of climate action and climate investing. So essentially, a big part of the answer to the question is, well, we just need to get serious and act on the things that we already know. Now, there are other aspects to this that are important and honestly quite worrying. Just a week ago, in mid-October, the IMF released its latest regional economic outlook for sub-Saharan Africa, and they pointed out what really ought to be obvious and very familiar to people who follow the region, is that many sub-Saharan African countries are experiencing what they call an acute funding squeeze. So, without going into too much detail, what we have is overall fiscal space and public revenues are under severe pressure. not just due to the COVID pandemic, but also due to unsustainable debt, yeah, and concerns around debt sustainability, uh, rising interest rates globally, a generally volatile, unpredictable, and in many ways uncertain and negative economic outlook. All of that has put, let's just say, fiscally, has put many African economies in a very tight spot. And if you cannot afford to spend on basics, if you cannot invest into any meaningful degree into things like critical infrastructure, then you are going to struggle to make meaningful headway in terms of trying to ramp up, scale up, and drive climate smart investing and, an investment geared towards driving climate action on the continent. And there, the outlook for many African economies is, we have to be honest here, is quite difficult. And it's not obvious if, when, or if that will turn around. The global outlook remains quite daunting, to be honest with you. And sub-Saharan African economies, they simply can't escape that. And to an extent, there's not much that they can do about that, which for me raises a very important issue, which is the question of the extent to which, not just domestically, the policy environment is conducive to, driving climate, to scaling up investment into climate action on the continent, but the global architecture, the global financial and economic architecture. And don't take my word for it. Look to the words of someone like President William Ruto of Kenya, who has on a number of occasions this year called out, the status quo, called out the powers that be that preside over the existing financial structure globally, which many argue, including President Ruto, is geared towards, or unfairly, is sort of unfairly restrictive towards Africa. And he has called for a need to shake up the global financial order and to make it more equal, much fairer towards Africa, which at a time of crisis that we're seeing right now is hugely important. The problem is that I'm not sure how many people are listening to his words. From my perspective, there's really no arguing with what he's saying. I think it's a very overdue message, and one that will resonate with many people around the world. But the point being made here is that there's not that much at present that sub-Saharan African economies can do about that. And whether we like it or not, they are subject to the prevailing fiscal regime. Which brings me back to something I alluded to earlier, which is, we are living through a time of quite consequential and profound global economic and political change and transition. And perhaps within that lies the opportunity to address this challenge of how the global policy framework either supports or inhibits the ability of African economies to drive meaningful economic development, including climate action. And to what extent we should be appealing to the status quo for change, because I'm not convinced that it will come from there, and that perhaps there needs to be a little bit more of a strategic rethink of, how, given the constraints that are out there, how can we position ourselves and who can we work with to circumnavigate some of these difficulties, which are going to be here for a while. The debt issue, the lack of fiscal space, the acute funding squeeze, as the IMF puts it, it's going to be here for quite some time. This one is actually very simple. Stop talking, start doing. Results speak for themselves. Actions speak louder than words. It's that simple. We know what needs to be done. There's nothing objectively stopping Africa from getting its act together, changing the game for itself, taking its rightful place as a global leader when it comes to the challenge of tackling and fighting climate change and driving climate action. but we need to talk less and do more. It's that simple. We just need to do what we already know. Of sounding like a broken record, I think the answer to this is the same as the previous question. It's less talking, more doing. There's I I don't believe that there is some sort of great bias out there against Africa, to be honest with you. Um, you know, Capital, money in general, is fairly agnostic about where it goes. It goes where it is welcome. It goes where it can earn a return, and it goes where the conditions are conducive to to doing business. It's that simple. So, what do you do? Well, look for the good examples. There are good examples on the continent. Ask yourself, what are they doing right, and emulate them. Just like I don't want to sound like I'm oversimplifying this, but it's like, we know what needs to be done. Just do it, and like the results will come. You don't need to go out there and sell yourself and kind of make this argument of, oh, you've got it wrong, you've got it wrong, you've got it wrong. If you put the right conditions in place, if you're following through, it speaks for itself, and people will take notice, and you'll have to do a lot less convincing. So it's just, just deliver on what you say you're going to do. And the question was, how do you tell people that Africa is open for business? And here I'm going to be a little bit critical. For me, the issue isn't being open for business, it's being ready for business. Just because you're open doesn't mean you're necessarily ready. Africa needs to be ready for business. That's the challenge. And there's no reason why it can't be. Right? That's important. There's no objective reason why these things can and will not happen. We've seen, we have such fantastic examples from around the world of countries that have transformed themselves in a manner of, in the space of a few decades, gone from what people would call poor to now being highly industrialized. Change can happen quickly, but you got to be really serious. You got to be really committed and dedicated. If Africa does that, the place will be transformed. It's that simple. Climate change doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care where you're from. It doesn't care where you live. It doesn't care about how far away you think you might be from the problem. This is not a problem for Africa. It's not a problem for Asia. It's not a problem for Europe, etc., etc. This is a human problem, and it's one that, I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but if nothing is done about this, our collective future is at stake. If that doesn't compel one to at least take an interest in how the world is responding to the impact of climate change, what is being done to drive climate action to make sure that we do not end up with an unstoppable calamity, then I'm not sure what will. But I will say this: there is no place to hide. So if you think you can ignore it, you are wrong. In the same way that you may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you, same applies to climate change. And that's the sort of, I guess that's the kind of the negative, the scary bit. The positive bit is that tremendous change is underway. So much more can be done. What's important to realize is that a much better world is actually possible. A sustainable world is actually possible. And who doesn't want to live in a more healthy, more sustainable world? I'm not sure what else to say. Like, I don't know. I really hope that there aren't too many people out there who think that this is something you can ignore, that this is something you can pretend doesn't matter to you, because you've got the wrong end of the stick.